The bitter wind of December 1776 cut through General George Washington's worn coat as he stood on the banks of the Delaware River, watching ice chunks drift downstream like broken dreams. Behind him, the remnants of the Continental Army huddled around dying campfires, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the freezing air. These were not the proud soldiers who had marched from Boston months earlier, but hollow-eyed specters of defeat, their bare feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. Washington's weathered hands trembled as he unfolded a dispatch from Congress. The message was stark. Enlistments would expire on December 3rd, and without a decisive victory, the cause of American independence would die with the old year. The general's aide-de-camp, Colonel Joseph Reed, approached with cautious steps, recognizing the weight of despair that had settled over their commander like a shroud. "Sir, the men are asking about provisions," Reed whispered, though both knew. There were precious few to distribute. Across the river, British and Hessian forces controlled Trenton, their warm quarters and full bellies a mocking contrast to the American suffering. General William Howe had declared the rebellion all but crushed, and from his comfortable headquarters in New York, he planned a final campaign that would end this colonial uprising once and for all. The intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Colonel Johann Rauel commanded nearly 1,500 Hessian troops in Trenton, professional soldiers whose reputation for discipline and ferocity had been earned on European battlefields. These were not the gentlemen soldiers of the British regular army, but hardened mercenaries who showed little mercy to rebels. Washington knew that any assault on such a force would be desperate, perhaps suicidal. Yet as the general studied his ragged army, he saw something that the enemy could not comprehend. In their sunken eyes burned the fierce light of men who had nothing left to lose. They had crossed the point where retreat meant death as surely as advance, where surrender promised only the hangman's noose. These farmers and merchants, blacksmiths and clerks, transformed into something more dangerous than professional soldiers. They had become true believers in an impossible dream. Thomas Paine's words echoed in Washington's mind. "These are the times that try men's souls." The pamphleteer's recent essay had circulated through the camps like wildfire, reminding every soldier why they fought. Not for king or country in the old sense, but for the radical notion that common men could govern themselves, that birth did not determine worth, that freedom was not a privilege to be granted, but a right to be seized. As darkness fell over the Delaware, Washington made his decision. The crossing would begin at sunset on Christmas Day, when enemy vigilance would be at its lowest. He would stake everything on one desperate throw of the dice, knowing that failure meant not just military defeat but the death of an idea that had barely begun to take root in human hearts. The general's voice was steady as he called his officers together, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Tomorrow would bring either the salvation of their cause or its final bloody conclusion. There would be no middle ground, no honorable surrender, no retreat into comfortable exile. Victory or death, those were the only choices left to men who had dared to challenge an empire. The snow began falling at dusk on December 25th, 1776, as if nature herself conspired to cloak Washington's desperate gambit. The general stood at the river's edge, watching his soldiers drag the Durham boats into position with numb, frost-bitten hands. These vessels, designed for hauling iron ore, would carry 2,400 men across the ice-choked Delaware in what history would remember as one of the war's most audacious moments. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, barely 20 years old but already trusted with Washington's artillery, supervised the loading of the precious cannon. Each piece represented months of careful accumulation, scraped together from captured British guns and donations from colonial foundries. The young officer's breath formed crystalline clouds as he shouted orders over the howling wind, his voice cracking with cold and determination, according to military historian David Hackett Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing. The operation required precise timing and unprecedented coordination among units that had known only defeat for months. The crossing began at 6 in the evening, with Washington himself among the first to step into the treacherous boats. Ice chunks, some as large as millstones, threatened to crush the fragile vessels or sweep them downstream into British-controlled waters. The Marblehead fishermen, led by Colonel John Glover, proved invaluable in navigating the deadly crossing. These Massachusetts mariners, their hands hardened by years of Atlantic fishing, worked the oars with professional skill, while Continental soldiers huddled in the boat bottoms, clutching their muskets with fingers too cold to feel the triggers. Many of these men had never seen a body of water larger than a mill pond, yet they trusted their lives to the judgment of sailors they barely knew. General Nathaniel Greene commanded the left column, his Rhode Island methodical nature perfectly suited to the careful coordination required for night movement. The Southern-born general had learned warfare through bitter experience, transforming from a Quaker ironworker into one of Washington's most reliable commanders. His men moved like ghosts through the forest, their footsteps muffled by the deepening snow. Meanwhile, General John Sullivan led the right column along the river road. His New Hampshire soldiers, accustomed to winter warfare but unprepared for the stakes of this particular night. Sullivan, known for his aggressive temperament and occasional tactical blunders, had been carefully briefed on the importance of maintaining silence and discipline. One premature gunshot, one shouted command, could alert the Hessian sentries and doom the entire enterprise. The crossing took longer than anticipated. What Washington had planned as a swift 4-hour operation stretched past midnight. With ice and weather conspiring against every movement, soldiers slipped on the frozen riverbank. Muskets were soaked beyond use, and more than one man simply collapsed from exhaustion and cold. Yet they continued, driven by something stronger than military discipline. The knowledge that this night would determine whether their children would live as free men or colonial subjects. As the last boat touched the New Jersey shore, Washington gathered his officers for final instructions. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Strike Trenton at dawn, when the Hessians would be recovering from Christmas celebrations and least prepared for battle. 2 columns would attack simultaneously from different directions, preventing escape. While maximizing surprise, speed and shock would compensate for their numerical disadvantage and inadequate equipment. The general's watch showed 3 in the morning as the army began its 9-mile march to Trenton. Behind them, the Delaware continued its relentless flow, carrying away any possibility of retreat. Ahead lay either victory or annihilation, with no middle ground for men who had already wagered everything on the dream of independence. The first gray light of December 26th revealed a landscape transformed by war and weather. Trenton lay quiet under its blanket of snow. The Hessian garrison secure in their winter quarters, confident that no army would dare march in such conditions. Colonel Johann Raoul, the German commander, had dismissed intelligence reports of American activity as mere winter raids, unworthy of serious military attention. Washington's columns approached the sleeping town like the closing jaws of a trap. The general rode with Greene's division along the Pennington Road, his horses' hooves crunching softly in the fresh powder. Every breath formed visible clouds, and the silence was so complete that the squeak of leather and jingle of equipment seemed thunderous to ears, straining for signs of discovery. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, led the advance guard with Lieutenant James Monroe at his side. These young Virginians moved with the careful precision of hunters stalking dangerous prey. Knowing that premature detection would transform their surprise attack into a desperate frontal assault against prepared positions. The narrow streets of Trenton stretched before them like a maze where every corner might conceal enemy sentries. At exactly 8 o'clock, a carefully orchestrated plan erupted into chaos. A Hessian guard spotted the advancing Americans and fired his musket, the sharp crack echoing off the wooden buildings like a gunshot in a cathedral. The element of surprise lasted mere seconds before professional instincts took over on both sides, transforming the quiet morning into a maelstrom of smoke, steel, and shouted commands in 3 different languages. Captain Alexander Hamilton unlimbered his battery at the head of King Street, his cannon speaking with voices of iron and fire. The young artillery officer had positioned his guns with mathematical precision, their muzzles commanding the main thoroughfares and preventing organized Hessian resistance. Each blast sent grape shots scything through the ranks of enemy soldiers. Stumbling from their quarters, many still in nightclothes and fumbling with unfamiliar equipment, the Hessians, for all their professional reputation, found themselves caught in a tactical nightmare. Their neat European formations, so effective on open battlefields, became death traps in the confined streets of an American town. Colonel Rowell, roused from his quarters by the sound of battle, attempted to rally his men in the town square. But American marksmen picked off his officers with the deadly accuracy that had made colonial riflemen legendary. According to military records preserved in the National Archives, the battle lasted less than an hour, but in that brief span, the entire character of the Revolutionary War changed forever. The Continental Army, which had known only retreat and defeat, suddenly remembered how to fight. Soldiers who had been ready to desert found themselves charging forward with fixed bayonets, their battle cries echoing off buildings as they swept through streets they had never seen before. General Sullivan's column attacked from the south with equal fury, trapping the Hessians between two forces of vengeful Americans. The German soldiers, renowned for their discipline under fire, broke ranks and fled toward the Assanpink Creek, only to find their escape route blocked by more Continental troops. What had begun as a surprise attack became a complete encirclement. With professional soldiers surrendering to the same rabble, they had dismissed as unworthy opponents. The victory was total and unprecedented. Nearly 900 Hessian prisoners were taken, along with their artillery, small arms, and precious supplies. More importantly, the Continental Army had proven to itself and the watching world that American soldiers could defeat European professionals in open battle. The psychological impact of Trenton would resonate far beyond the military significance, transforming a rebellion on the verge of collapse into a revolution with renewed hope and determination. The immediate aftermath of Trenton revealed victories within victories, as Washington's exhausted soldiers discovered that their desperate gamble had yielded far more than they had dared to hope. The captured Hessian supplies alone were worth their weight in gold to an army that had been surviving on frozen turnips and whatever forage they could find in the New Jersey countryside. Among the prisoners was Colonel Johann Rowell himself, mortally wounded while attempting to rally his men in the town square. The German officer, who had dismissed the Americans as country clowns, incapable of serious military action, died acknowledging the skill and courage of his captors. His final words, reported by his aide-de-camp, expressed amazement at the tactical sophistication of what he had assumed would be nothing more than a militia raid. The intelligence value of the captured documents proved even more significant than the material gains. Washington's staff officers, poring over Hessian correspondence and orders, discovered the complete disposition of British forces throughout New Jersey. General William Howe's winter strategy lay exposed in meticulous German records, revealing weaknesses and opportunities that the Continental Army could exploit in the coming months. News of the victory spread through the colonies with unprecedented speed, carried by riders who changed horses at every crossroads in their eagerness to share the impossible news. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress, which had been preparing to flee westward, suddenly discovered new reserves of courage and determination. Delegates who had privately questioned Washington's leadership now praised his strategic genius. With the enthusiasm of converted believers, the psychological impact on British leadership proved equally profound. General Howe, comfortable in his New York headquarters, received reports of the defeat with disbelief that gradually transformed into alarm. His carefully planned winter campaign, designed to crush the rebellion through systematic occupation of key towns, suddenly appeared vulnerable to American counterattacks he had never seriously considered. King George III's reaction, recorded in diplomatic correspondence preserved in the British National Archives, revealed the global implications of what had seemed like a minor colonial skirmish. European powers, particularly France and Spain, were watching American developments with keen interest, waiting for signs that the rebellion might succeed before committing their own resources to the anti-British cause. But perhaps the most crucial consequence remained invisible to contemporary observers. The victory at Trenton demonstrated that the Continental Army could function as a coordinated military force rather than a collection of regional militias. The complex river crossing, the coordinated two-column attack, and the efficient processing of prisoners all required institutional capabilities that transformed Washington's force from a revolutionary mob into a legitimate army. The re-enlistment crisis that had threatened to destroy the Continental Army evaporated overnight. Soldiers who had been counting days until their discharge suddenly found reasons to continue serving. The bounty money offered by Congress certainly helped. But more important was the restoration of faith in their cause and confidence in their commander. Men who had been ready to return to their farms now spoke of marching to New York and driving the British into the sea. Foreign military observers, particularly the French officers who would later join the American cause, identified Trenton as the moment when the colonial rebellion achieved military credibility. European warfare required not just courage but technical competence, logistical capability, and command structure that could coordinate complex operations under adverse conditions. Washington's Christmas crossing had demonstrated all of these qualities in a single, brilliantly executed operation. The strategic initiative had shifted decisively. British commanders who had been planning their spring offensive to crush the remaining centers of rebellion now found themselves forced to defend positions they had considered secure. The psychological advantage that had sustained them through months of easy victories suddenly belonged to an enemy they had underestimated. Washington understood that victory at Trenton was meaningless unless followed by immediate action. The element of surprise that had served him so well would quickly dissipate as British commanders adjusted their strategies and reinforced their vulnerable positions. On December 30th, 1776, as his soldiers celebrated their first taste of victory in months, the general was already planning the next, even more audacious strike. Intelligence reports indicated that General Charles Cornwallis was marching south from New York with a substantial force, determined to avenge the Hessian defeat and restore British prestige. The Earl, one of Britain's most capable commanders, brought with him over 8,000 veteran troops and a reputation for aggressive tactics that had served the Crown well in previous campaigns. The town of Princeton, 10 miles northeast of Trenton, held 3 regiments of British regulars under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood. These were not hired German mercenaries, but professional British soldiers, men who had served in India and the Caribbean, hardened by years of imperial warfare and confident in their superiority over colonial opponents. Washington's War Council on New Year's Eve revealed the desperate nature of their situation. The Continental Army numbered fewer than 5,000 effective soldiers, many still recovering from the rigors of the Delaware crossing and the Trenton assault. Their ammunition was limited, their artillery light, and their supply lines virtually non-existent. Any conventional military strategist would have recommended immediate retreat to more defensible positions. Instead, Washington proposed another night march, this time aimed at Princeton while Cornwallis advanced on Trenton. The plan required precise timing and extraordinary luck. The American army would have to slip past British pickets, march through unfamiliar terrain in darkness, and attack a prepared enemy at dawn. One miscalculation would trap them between 2 superior forces with no possibility of escape. General Hugh Mercer, a Scottish-born physician turned soldier, would lead the advance guard along the Quaker Road toward Princeton. Pennsylvanians familiar with the local terrain understood that they were being asked to stake their lives on another desperate gamble. Yet the memory of Trenton had transformed these citizen soldiers into believers in both their cause and their commander. The march began at midnight on January 2nd, 1777, with Washington himself leading the main body while leaving skeleton forces to maintain campfires visible to British scouts. The deception worked perfectly. Cornwallis, advancing confidently toward what he believed was the trapped American army, found only empty positions and cold ashes when dawn revealed his error. Meanwhile, the Continental Army moved through the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by more fresh snow. The bitter cold that had nearly destroyed them at the Delaware now served as an ally, hardening the muddy roads and reducing the noise of their passage. Veterans of the Trenton crossing recognized the familiar mixture of fear and anticipation that preceded another throw of the dice. At sunrise, Mercer's advance guard encountered British light infantry on the outskirts of Princeton, and the carefully planned surprise attack immediately devolved into a chaotic running battle. The Scottish general, leading from the front, as always, mortally wounded in the first exchange of volleys, his death threatening to demoralize troops who had come to trust his steady leadership under fire. The crisis deepened as British regulars, displaying the professional competence that had made them masters of 3 continents, began to overwhelm the American left flank. These were not the surprised Hessians of Trenton, but veteran soldiers fighting on familiar ground with complete confidence in their tactical superiority. The Continental line began to waver, then break, as panic spread through ranks that had tasted victory just days before. Washington himself rode directly into the crisis, his presence on the battlefield transforming retreat into renewed attack. The general, exposing himself to enemy fire with apparent indifference to personal danger, rallied his scattered troops and led them in a charge that broke British resistance and sent Mohood's regulars fleeing toward New Brunswick. The Battle of Princeton concluded with American forces in possession of the field. But Washington recognized that his position remained precarious. British reinforcements were marching from multiple directions, and his own army, exhausted by 2 major engagements in 10 days, could not sustain another prolonged campaign without rest and resupply. The casualties from Princeton told a sobering story. General Hugh Mercer's death deprived the Continental Army of one of its most experienced commanders, while dozens of other officers and enlisted men had fallen in the sharp fighting around the college buildings. Yet the strategic gains far outweighed these losses. Another British garrison had been defeated, more supplies captured, and the myth of enemy invincibility further eroded. Captain Alexander Hamilton, his artillery having played crucial roles in both battles, wrote to his mentor John Jay that the victories had transformed the character of the war itself. No longer could British commanders dismiss American forces as mere rabble, incapable of coordinated military action. The Continental Army had demonstrated tactical sophistication and operational capability that demanded respect from even the most skeptical professional soldiers. The psychological impact on colonial morale proved immeasurable. Throughout the 13 states, communities that had been preparing to submit to British authorities suddenly rediscovered their revolutionary fervor. Militia units that had disbanded during the dark days of December began reforming, and recruitment for the regular army increased dramatically as news of the victories spread. Perhaps more significantly, the international implications of Princeton began to manifest in European diplomatic circles. French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Count de Vergennes, had been watching American developments with calculated interest, waiting for evidence that the colonial rebellion had actually succeed before committing French resources to the anti-British cause. The British response revealed the depth of their concern. General Howe, his comfortable winter quarters strategy, in ruins ordered the evacuation of most New Jersey positions and consolidated his forces around New York and Philadelphia. The aggressive campaign that was supposed to crush the rebellion in the spring of 1777 had been reduced to defensive preparations. Against an enemy that had proven capable of striking anywhere at any time, Washington's decision to withdraw to winter quarters at Morristown demonstrated strategic wisdom that complemented his tactical brilliance. The mountainous terrain of northern New Jersey provided natural defensive advantages, while keeping his army close enough to British positions to threaten any attempted advance. The Continental Army, which had nearly dissolved in December, entered the winter of 1777 as a legitimate military force. The intelligence networks established during the Princeton campaign would serve American interests throughout the remainder of the war. Local farmers and merchants, emboldened by Continental successes, began providing detailed information about British movements and dispositions. What had been a hostile or neutral population gradually transformed into active supporters of the revolutionary cause, training and discipline. The 2 elements most lacking in the early Continental Army began to improve dramatically during the Morristown encampment. Officers who had learned hard lessons during the Trenton-Princeton campaign implemented new standards of drill and organization, while enlisted men gained confidence in their ability to face European professionals on equal terms. The logistical lessons of the winter campaign proved equally valuable. Washington's staff officers developed new systems for supply procurement, medical care, and communication that would serve the Army well in the larger campaigns to come. The desperate improvisation that had characterized the Delaware crossing gave way to institutional competence that made future victories possible by spring. The Continental Army that emerged from Morristown bore little resemblance to the defeated force that had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night. The same men who had been ready to abandon the cause in December now spoke confidently of ultimate victory, their faith restored by commanders who had proven capable of achieving the impossible when necessity demanded it. The true significance of Princeton emerged not in the immediate aftermath of battle, but in the cascading consequences that transformed a colonial rebellion into a global war for American independence. What Washington and his contemporaries could not fully comprehend in January 1777 was that their desperate winter campaign had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of power in ways that would determine the outcome of the entire conflict. The French decision to provide covert aid to the American cause, formalized in the Treaty of Alliance of 1778, traced its origins directly to the victories at Trenton and Princeton. King Louis XVI's ministers, calculating the costs and benefits of challenging British imperial power, identified the Continental Army's demonstrated capability as the crucial factor that transformed American independence from an impossible dream into an achievable goal. Spanish participation in the anti-British coalition followed similar logic. The court at Madrid, traditionally cautious about supporting revolutionary movements that might inspire their own colonial subjects, concluded that American military competence justified the risks of intervention. The strategic implications of a successful American rebellion, particularly the potential for opening British territories to Spanish expansion, outweighed concerns about revolutionary contagion. The Dutch Republic's eventual entry into the conflict, though delayed until 1780, also reflected European reassessment of American capabilities first demonstrated during the Princeton campaign. Amsterdam's bankers, practical men, concerned primarily with profit margins and risk calculations, began extending credit to the Continental Congress. Based on their evaluation of Washington's military leadership and the institutional development of American armed forces, British strategic planning underwent equally dramatic revision. General John Burgoyne's ambitious campaign from Canada, which culminated in disaster at Saratoga, originated partly from London's recognition that the rebellion could no longer be suppressed through limited colonial operations. The Princeton campaign had demonstrated that American forces were capable of coordinating complex strategic movements and sustaining operational tempo that required British responses at the highest levels of military planning. The development of American naval power, though often overlooked by historians focused on land campaigns, also traced crucial origins to the Princeton period. The confidence gained through successful land operations encouraged colonial maritime ventures that eventually challenged British control of North American waters. Privateering expanded dramatically as merchants concluded that American independence was achievable rather than merely aspirational. Economic warfare, perhaps the most decisive element in the ultimate American victory, received crucial impetus from the psychological impact of Princeton. Colonial merchants who had been hedging their bets between British and American authorities now committed wholeheartedly to non-importation agreements and other forms of commercial resistance. The economic pressure that eventually forced British recognition of American independence began with the renewed confidence that followed. Washington's winter victories, the institutional development of American military leadership, visible in the careers of officers who served during the Princeton campaign, provided the foundation for subsequent major victories. Alexander Hamilton's service with the artillery taught him lessons about coordination and logistics that served him well as Secretary of the Treasury. James Monroe's experience as a junior officer shaped his understanding of executive authority. When he later served as president, international recognition of American legitimacy, though not formalized until French diplomatic recognition in 1778, began with European military observers' assessment of Continental Army performance. During the Princeton campaign, professional soldiers from France, Prussia, and other European powers identified the tactical sophistication and operational capability that distinguished the Americans from other colonial rebels. The transformation of American political culture, from colonial resistance to revolutionary republicanism, received crucial reinforcement from the military successes that began at Princeton. Citizens who had been uncertain about the possibility of independence gained confidence in their ability to govern themselves when they observed their ability to defeat the world's most powerful military forces. Perhaps most significantly, Princeton campaign established the precedent for American strategic thinking that would influence the nation's approach to military affairs for generations. The willingness to take calculated risks, the emphasis on mobility and surprise over conventional force-and-force confrontation, and the integration of military operations with political objectives all became characteristic elements of American warfare that traced their origins to Washington's winter gamble. The hidden victory of Princeton was not merely tactical or even strategic, but transformational, converting a failing colonial rebellion into the foundation of an independent, a nation that would eventually challenge European dominance of global affairs. In crossing the Delaware and marching to Princeton, Washington's army crossed the threshold between colonial resistance and Revolutionary War, ensuring that American independence would become not just a remote possibility, but an inevitable conclusion to the conflict they had dared to begin.